It's the week ending Saturday the 20th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen Brexit talk stalling in Brussels, Donald Trump casting doubt over a journalist's disappearance at the hands of the Saudi regime, and Patisserie Valerie suspending trading as questionable accounting is uncovered. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Arion, McNicoll, Jamie Timson, and from the Week Junior, Felicity, Capon. And Felicity, you're starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
In the blue corner, weighing heavily under international pressure, we have Saudi Arabia.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia invites the world to witness history. Live from the beautiful city of Jeddah and the King Abdullah Sports City Stadium, 7 championships will be defended, including a ladder match for the Intercontinental Championship and Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns, a Universal title rematch inside a steel cage.
Neither of these superstars is leaving this match without a few scars.
Plus, John Cena and Triple H go one-on-one. And The Undertaker, Rusev, in a casket match.
Rest in peace.
Then, for the first time ever, 50 men, 1 ring. The greatest Royal Rumble ever on WWE Network. As always, free for new subscribers.
That was a trail for the WWE Greatest Royal Rumble 2018. It happened in April, if you were keen to sign up for tickets. Felicity, with everything that's going on with Saudi Arabia, will it be happening there again?
It looks like it will, although there's a lot of international pressure, and so it's sort of up in the air a little bit. So this is the weird and wonderful world of World Wrestling Entertainment, known as WWE. And back in April, Saudi Arabia hosted its first ever Greatest Royal Rumble, featuring all sorts of wrestling stars, including Monster among the men. I'm sure you've heard of him.
I have now. I've heard the trailer. They had The Undertaker. I didn't even know he was still going. Is it the same Undertaker that was The Undertaker when I was a kid?
Dead. Yeah.
He'll live forever while also being dead.
Yes.
He's a very old man now, though.
I was going to say, I was a child at the time, so everyone looked old, but he was 40 then.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's kind of pushing, he's nearly 60.
Yeah.
He's still doing some of the moves, though. He's still throwing himself about. He's a company man.
Okay, and Felicity,
Anyway.
why is this your story?
Anyway, so in April, it was a big event. It attracted about 60,000 people at the King Abdullah Sports City Stadium in Jeddah. And it was supposed to be the start of a long-term deal to bring more wrestling to the kingdom. And there's due to be the second event on November the 2nd called the Crown Jewel. But all that has been thrown into turmoil and chaos following...
Or a casket, to be on
Well,
brand.
yes. That's a bit dark. Following the disappearance of the Saudi journalist and Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who it looks by all accounts has been brutally murdered in Istanbul at the hands of Mohammed bin Salman, who is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, his henchman.
Yeah,
So,
henchman is doing a lot of work in that sentence, isn't it? No one's alleging it was the Crown Prince himself. But
Yeah,
certainly, spotlight on Saudi Arabia at the moment.
Big story.
And therefore, when you say international pressure, on WWE, from who?
From America, actually, and Republican senators in particular. Republican senators like Lindsey Graham and the like are saying that they want to cut their ties with Saudi Arabia and that WWE, the match should be elsewhere. And WWE haven't sort of said what they're going to do, but they might move it to Manchester in the UK and remove it from Saudi Arabia.
Why is this the story of the week? You know, you're saying everyone else's attention is on the death of Khashoggi and whether or not it was caused by the Saudi government, directly or indirectly. You're saying that the focus instead should be on an outfit that, but you know, it's not like they're selling guns to Saudi Arabia, they're selling spandex.
Well, I think it's to do with Saudi Arabia and it's kind of Mohammed bin Salman wanting to very much project the country, the kingdom, as a more liberal, progressive place. This whole project of his called Vision 2030 about, liberalizing the kingdom. But actually, there are so many, because of this story, there are so many areas now that it looks like people are pulling out of Saudi Arabia and ties are being broken down.
I think what's also interesting is that if you look at something like wrestling and the kind of the niche, or it seems even not really a niche in American popular culture, it kind of holds the same place as things like country music, and it certainly appeals to a certain demographic of people. In fact, like a lot of what the wrestling events that happen are geared around, quite a lot of the time, the US Army. Like they go over to camps in the Middle East and perform for them. They have some of the characters in the wrestling are army based or have like army tropes, and so it's interesting to see that even within a kind of a company or a part of the culture that you think would actually be pretty pro whatever the US government stance is, there is this uncomfortability within the WWE towards going to Saudi Arabia. And there was, before the Khashoggi incident, part of the thing with going to Saudi Arabia and doing an event there is that the women on the roster of the wrestling can't wrestle. And they won't be allowed. And the talent themselves, the wrestling talent themselves, have voiced their uncomfortability about that.
Stop saying uncomfortability. I will not allow this to pass. I let it go. Was discomfort is the word you're looking for, surely. Excellent pronunciation of Khashoggi, though. Yeah. So, Arion, is Jamie sort of right to suggest that WWE never should have signed up to be in Saudi at all? However many millions of dollars they're going to chuck at them, they don't share values concomitant with running that particular championship.
Yeah, I mean, probably not, and it kind of underlines the deep uncomfortability between the US and Saudi Arabia as bedfellows anyway. For a long time there has been a weirdness that the sort of bastion for liberal democracy was so close politically and economically with a Middle Eastern country that has particular strain of Islam that's quite intense and contrary to a lot of America's values. So I think that there is something to that. And I think also it kind of punctures the efforts of Mohammed bin Salman to paint himself as this great reformer and a new face of Saudi Arabia, and it's still very early in his project in what he was attempting to do. But I think that the scales have fallen from people's eyes a little bit, and no longer does the world accept the narrative that he was trying to construct, which was that he's opening the kingdom up, and it's changed entirely, and it's ready for things like WWE to come to.
There were a lot of people in Saudi Arabia at the time saying, "Don't believe this." There's a guy, a very interesting kind of Saudi PhD academic called Baghdadi, and he was saying for a long time, look, this is completely false, these ideas of reform. This guy is completely a part of the same oppression that's been happening for the kind of 30, 50 years. And now he did this great set of tweets recently, which was just saying, look, what do you want me to say? Like, I'm not going to say I told you so because people are dying out here, but look, this isn't reform. This wasn't reform.
So, to return to my question, Felicity, should WWE have not taken the money?
It's a weird one because I don't see why, as horrific and awful as this murder of the journalist is, I don't see why now it's suddenly created this massive schism. I mean, like Jamie says, I don't think anyone's under any illusion that Saudi Arabia is still a very brutal regime. Look at Yemen, for example. You have school buses full of kids being, blown up under the Saudi government. There's no human rights in Saudi Arabia towards a lot of marginalised people. So it's weird in some ways that this, I'm kind of sad that this is what it's taken for the pressure to be exerted on Saudi Arabia. But there are other interesting elements to this, and that is Trump and the McMahon family that runs WWE. So they are more than friendly. Trump has hosted 2 WrestleManias in Atlantic City. And after Trump became a reality TV star, the McMahons teamed up with Trump again for another WrestleMania. And now...
there was that clip, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Do you remember that clip where a wrestler with Trump's face beat up CNN?
Yeah. Well, no, other way around.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go on.
It's actual Donald Trump
yeah.
beating up a wrestler on whose head they have superimposed the CNN logo.
So Trump took part in WrestleMania as well as funding it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And actually, the family have donated millions to the Trump Foundation. And Linda McMahon, who is the wife of the guy who runs it, is now appointment to the Small Business Administration. So kind of almost part of Trump's cabinet.
Donald Trump.
So they are very much in bed together. And you only have to hear Trump sort of giving Saudi Arabia the benefit of the doubt over the murder. I mean, he's very aware of how much money, and he's a businessman through and through. So it's a very awkward one, really, for Trump.
Donald Trump is the only president to have received a stone cold stunner to this point. I think also from a capitalist perspective, you have to understand that for the WWE, they would get out of an event at Saudi Arabia somewhere in the region of $60 million, which, to put in perspective, is probably the same, if not slightly more, than they get for the biggest show, the WrestleMania, which is the big one of the every year. So just from this one event in Saudi Arabia, they're earning more than perhaps they would do at any other point in the year.
Why? Can we just talk about what is the appeal? It is made up, isn't it? It's not real sport, right?
It is
it's
made
nonsense.
up, but it's...
What's the? I mean, it's like doing a panto, isn't it? What?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
but a really high energy, super athletic panto that has great stunts and great storylines.
You've
and
obviously
characters.
never been to the Churchill Theatre Bromley panto because if it's that brief,
Yeah.
it doesn't cost $40 million of that, I'm sure.
But the event in April, the first one to be held in Jeddah, was extremely interesting because it wasn't the innocent pantomime that you might expect it to have been. There were two wrestlers who were Americans of Iranian descent, Ariya and Sean Davari, who came into the ring and were telling the other Saudi wrestlers, sort of goading them and saying, you're not real athletes and only Iranian athletes are the true athletes. And obviously Saudi Arabia and Iran are huge foes and huge rivals. And they were booed off stage. I mean, there was that pantomime element, but then apparently these American Iranians got death threats for it. So they've kind of brought in this whole sort of new political dimension to this kind of wrestling world, which is a little bit frightening.
Although at the same time, WWE has historical plot lines that have often set up goodies and baddies and right and wrong and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but you don't want to be playing the baddie when you're in Saudi Arabia, do you?
No, you probably don't.
Iranian baddie.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do have this sort of the Iron Sheik in the 80s and Rusev a few years ago. So you've got the emergence of geopolitics onto the wrestling ring, and it's long been part of it. And in fact, wrestling has a connection with politics that runs deeper than that, because you've got people like Jesse the Body Ventura running for or becoming governor of Minnesota, and Linda McMahon, who Felicity mentioned, made 2 unsuccessful Senate bids. She didn't make it. And this year you've got another very prominent wrestler called Kane, that's his stage name, who's in the running to be mayor of Knox County in Tennessee. So, there's this long connection between politics and wrestling, and you can sort of see why it is, because there is a kind of morality play going on within the ring, and there's something of that in the political arena as well.
Okay, but in all seriousness, Felicity, final point on this. When we look back at this week, this will be the crucial event in how Mohammed bin Salman's reign in Saudi Arabia is seen, not the murder of Khashoggi.
It's a big deal. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of high-profile politicians saying it can't go ahead. I think this week should be remembered for that. It just goes to show that a huge event worth millions of dollars is over.
Well, with great uncomfortability, Arion, I turn to you. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week will be remembered for the worst breakup in 1,000 years.
From the point of view of developments on the ground, the biggest civil unrest risks from this situation will be in Ukraine, where we expect that there will be some disputes over control and ownership of religious assets such as monasteries or churches. And now there is quite likely that there will be scuffles and fights over who controls what, including some historic churches and monasteries in Kiev and other major cities in Ukraine.
It was a post-match interview with The Undertaker. No, it was, in fact, Alex Kokcharov, a principal research analyst at global information group IHS Markit, speaking to TRT World. And Arion, I kind of got what he was saying. It's about Russia and Ukraine and something about the Russian Orthodox Church. Explain why this is your story of the week.
Yeah, so on Monday, the Russian Orthodox Church made moves to sever all ties with the Constantinople Patriarchate, which is the Orthodox Mother Church. And this was in protest against the Constantinople's moves towards recognizing an independent Orthodox Church in Ukraine. If it does go through, which looks relatively likely, it will be the biggest split in Christianity in 1,000 years.
Whoa, that's a big thing to drop in.
Yeah, so
really?
Analysts are saying that it's going to be as profound as the East-West schism, also known as the Great Schism of 1054, when the Catholic Church split from the Orthodox Church.
You remember?
But yeah, so as significant as that, also because the Orthodox Church is a massive church, and this will mean pretty much half of the church, the Russian side, splitting from the rest of the Orthodox Church if it does go through.
But, we're not a sort of religious affairs discussion program, but theologically, what's the difference?
What's interesting about it actually is that politics and spirituality in the Orthodox Church is very interlinked. Look, let's face it; it's probably the truth of all religions. But in this case, the Ukrainian Orthodox churches have been saying that they want to get out from under Moscow rule. So there is a spiritual reason for them to want to separate as well. But it also connects, obviously, to the fact that in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and kicked off the war and the conflict in the Donbass region over in eastern Ukraine. And those countries are now not technically at war, but Russia and Ukraine continue to be involved in skirmishes.
So yeah, it's a kind of doubling down for Ukrainians who want very much to be recognised as Ukrainians and not part of Russia or in any way wishing to be part of Russia. And we're seeing that as well, aren't we, in Ukraine wanting to join NATO?
Yes, Ukraine does want to join NATO, and Putin has said that would be a red line for him. So I think overall from this story, you're seeing that this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better in terms of relations between Ukraine and Russia. And I think maybe living in the UK, it's perhaps one of those stories where you didn't realise that religion had such an impact on the kind of geopolitical landscape in that part of the world. And I think it's, when you look at kind of imagery of Putin, there is a lot of religious imagery, and I think the Kremlin and the Moscow Church are so close, and I think a lot of Ukrainians see the Moscow Church as a tool of the Kremlin, and it's those kind of funny images, I suppose, of Putin at Epiphany, when he's being like a macho man and like getting himself dunked into the freezing cold icy water and being blessed by his priest, and I think his plane is always blessed by priest before he flies off somewhere. So it's also a kind of like an imagery thing. It's very much a big deal for Putin and Russia, and it's just an outrage that Ukraine has broken away from Russia's sphere of influence, I suppose.
At this point as well, I think it's worth mentioning that when we think of the Soviet Union as covering the whole of the Ukraine as well, it also worked in terms of religion. A lot of religious scholars see the Kiev Church as being the real kind of main mover of that form of Christianity in that area, and then it was subsumed by the Soviet Union, obviously particularly with their kind of secular beliefs and that whole thing. And so a lot of it, as we've been saying, national identity for Ukrainians is very much intertwined with their own religious identity.
And simultaneously, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there's been this massive resurgence in followers of the Russian Orthodox Church. Even over the past 10 years, in 2008, 30% of the population of Russia self-identified as Russian Orthodox, and just this year 70%. So there's been this massive explosion of people believing in the Russian Orthodox Church and following it. But it is definitely a tie-up of that sort of between nationalism and religious identity. And a lot of the new followers of the religion don't even know the Ten Commandments and don't attend church. It's just kind of an identification thing.
Is there a problem as well with the way that the mainstream media cover religion? In Britain in particular, I'm thinking of this issue of, I suppose, people being of the same religion, but of such different opinions they go to war over it. It's obviously people in in England are very keenly aware of Protestants versus Catholics in Ireland, but they'll look over at the Middle East and, okay, maybe they know there's Sunni and Shia, but, you know, it'll be a common question. Well, they're all Muslims. Why are they fighting each other? And, you know, people probably just don't think there would be these kinds of really serious ructions between different strands of the Orthodox Church, because that kind of discussion isn't really had.
I think also it's that thing of when we have political freedom that we do in this country, we don't see religion as being a necessary form of expression, of political expression. And the fact is that in lots of places where political expression is kind of clamped down upon, religious freedom or the ability to express yourself in a religious way is actually one of the few ways that you can go against the government, or at least say things that basically just don't go along with what the government wants you to say, because religious freedom is still seen as being more acceptable in some places than political freedom. And so I think from a UK standpoint, it's quite difficult for us to understand that actually maybe two forms of orthodoxy would be fighting each other, because in our head they're all just under one banner.
But it's so interesting though, because I mean, I'm reading Wolf Hall at the moment, and you know, this country, one of the biggest moments in its history was Henry VIII deciding to break with Rome. You know, the Church of England came about because of that. So in some ways we should have some like long-term memory of the fact that it can be such a big deal and it can influence how, and it's just so brutal. Everyone's having their head chopped off over this issue in my book. And I think
you can't separate politics from religion as cleanly as you might like to. And certainly there were rumours within the Ukraine going around that the Russian Orthodox Church was operating almost as a kind of spying force in the Donetsk and Luhansk eastern regions that were where all the unrest is at the moment. And so you could understand why Ukrainians would feel uncomfortable about having their churches associated with the Russian Orthodox Church, if the Russian Orthodox Church has kind of become that aligned with Putin.
And the only other quick thing that I think is important about this story is that it could spread to the Balkans, because I think it now means that the Kiev Patriarchate could now win back parishes, not only in Ukraine, but in parts of Belarus and Lithuania, which would obviously be a huge issue for Putin.
The Serbian Orthodox Church is very closely linked to Russia, and Russia has been using that as a tentacle into the Balkans, and that could cause a lot of... I think this is a real flashpoint. And I think
these are coulds. How do you think this will play out in the next year or so? I
think in this area, I think that what we'll see is a ratcheting up of tensions, as we always like to say, a kind of deep uncomfortability in the area. But I also think that really, you know, the US has said, you know, there was an interview with the US Special Envoy to Ukraine in The Guardian recently, where he was saying that we're not afraid to give them weapons to fight back. Putin's on borrowed time in this region. We're not going to back down here. We are going to ratchet up. And the Ukrainian have just said that they're going to build a new military base in there. I think within the next year we could see real flashpoints.
Jamie, it's your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Was this the week we decided we needed to change the textbook definition of racism?
My only reservation would be, let's not almost make this a story of terrible oppression and gossip, because there are black people who, in spite of all the things that were done to us, who shone, who were brilliant, who were courageous, and we need to hear those stories as well. What we don't want is to have this just represented as another version of what terrible people did to other people.
And those are the stories, Trevor, that need to be coming out.
That was racial equalities campaigner Trevor Phillips talking to the BBC's Politics Live last week. Jamie, tell us briefly what happened last week, because this was a slightly under the radar story anyway, and then tell us what's happened this week.
Yeah, I think actually I've really nailed this week's podcast topic, FYI.
Yeah. Last week unwrapped with a bit of this week. That's the news item.
There are textbooks that have been recalled, GCSE sociology textbooks that have been recalled for what is actually quite shocking descriptions of families, different ethnicities in it. For instance, I'll just give an quick example. The textbook claimed that fathers and husbands are largely absent from Caribbean families, and the textbook continued without any empirical evidence, characterised by child shifting, that is the passing of children to other relatives or acquaintances. This is just one example. It also said that Chinese families were more focused on homework. In sub-Saharan Africa, individuals belong to a wide kinship network rather than a single family unit. Bearing in mind that sub-Saharan Africa covers 46 countries, of which there are probably about 1,000 different cultures. It was a big shock.
Anecdotal racial generalisations.
Yeah, in a sociology textbook.
So that textbook's been withdrawn?
Yes.
That was last week?
Yes.
What's happened this week?
So this week, HuffPost have done a kind of like a broader study into the textbooks and found that actually this is something that's happening more and more regularly within the study of sociology at a GCSE level. And there's been a kind of a broader discussion online about how we teach sociology and history. I think what's critical is that as the decline of things like personal education and social education, things like sociology are far more important. And actually, I'm sure we know because we've all been through it, it's generally been looked down at the nose of by people in society. You know, the study of sociology has always been a kind of, you know, what did they do? Oh, they did sociology. Oh, they did social studies. Like, it's been seen as being not that important, whereas actually, I think it should be.
OK. Felicity, at the Week Junior, you are talking to a young audience.
Yes.
What do you have to say on this subject? I mean, I presume you don't feature a lot of racist generalisations in your coverage.
I certainly hope not. We definitely don't. But I think...
the division between the casual corporate approach to podcasting and the official company line coming out there.
But I do think the idea of how we educate children about topics like history and sociology is really important, and also what's going on in schools that we're not aware of. And it's quite frightening that this textbook comes to light and, you know, we find out all these things. And it made me think about, you know, faith schools and the really extreme faith schools. So, you know, what are some schools teaching about abortion or same-sex marriage or, you know, things to do with sex education? Islamic schools, which are still separating girls and boys, or one story I read about a Jewish school censoring texts. An Ofsted report said this Jewish school, in science, pupils are not permitted to study animal or human reproduction, and other areas such as global warming are restricted. So quite a lot of kind of scary indoctrination going on that we're not aware of. In the story about that HuffPo was running, though, I do think it's tricky in some ways because it's about stereotypes, I suppose. And actually, not all stereotypes are bad. We shy away from the idea of making decisions based on stereotypes, and they have negative connotations. But actually, stereotypes are simple generalizations about how groups of people behave, and they can be valid just because there are going to be exceptions to the group. It's not to say that they're not always right. So, for example, just a few of them. Men are stereotyped as being violent relative to women, and actually the data backs that up, that a disproportionate number of men will commit violent crimes. We make other stereotypes based on age requirements. So the idea that people shouldn't be able to vote or drive a car at certain ages. Neither is actually based on universally valid generalizations. Some 25-year-olds shouldn't be voting, some 16-year-olds should be, some 12-year-olds could probably drive a car. So, and you do get positive stereotypes about black people being better athletes, for example. So it's interesting. I'm not saying the textbooks were right, but I think sociology probably is the study of stereotypes, right?
I was also trying to think about what the intention of those textbooks in particular was. And they were trying to expose people to the idea that some people live differently to you, and they have different home lives, and they have different intentions, and they operate in different ways. And yes, they got a lot of things wrong, and they made these sweeping generalizations that it's right to now revisit and improve upon. But I think that the study of sociology itself could almost be, there's another criticism coming at it, that you sort of feel that it's essential to maintain the study of it and the study of difference and the recognition of difference.
But how else do you learn about cultures?
This is my point, is that it shouldn't come through a GCSE in sociology. Like, that's the kind of things that people should learn about from the age of 5 and should be taught throughout school in things like personal and social and citizenship.
But imagine how dumbed down
lessons.
A textbook for 5-year-olds is going to be.
But it doesn't have to be a textbook, that's the thing.
It seems to me this
it doesn't have to be part of a curriculum.
But it seems to me this issue has partly come about because of the very reason you said it was seen as a slightly kind of drop-out, wishy-washy A-level choice. Therefore, a lot of the people studying it aren't going to be the sharpest tools in the shed. Therefore, the textbook is written at a level which is appropriate for 16 and 17-year-olds. Therefore, there isn't all the qualifying caveats we'd all like to see about the data and what it says, and there are exceptions. If you do one for a 5-year-old, that's just going to be further exaggerated, isn't it? But the stereotypes will get broader.
But what I'm saying is not that the 5-year-old should learn sociology, that there should be teaching of all of these things that we want in our day-to-day. It requires an overhaul of the educational system that doesn't leave teaching something like there are different cultures doesn't leave it to something like sociology GCSE to before they learn about it. Actually, it should come right from the very beginning, and we should move our way up. And the reason that everything is in a textbook is really broadly generalized is because of this like stupid notion that we have where they have to learn something like sociology should never be test based. It should never be like, what do Caribbean fathers do? Answer this question, and then we'll get you through and we'll give you a GCSE. Actually, something like sociology should be like, look around you. How is your society changing? What are the things that are going on in your society?
I mean, that's a debate, isn't it, Felicity, that is applied to a lot of subjects when you're talking to children. People say that about history, about geography. I'm sure there are some people that don't get as much airtime that say it about mathematics. Minority views aren't represented. There's not enough discussion, there's not enough experience.
Well, I think history is the most controversial one, I suppose, in terms of whether it was Gibbon or any other historian. You're always going to put your own biases and your own interpretation of events onto things, and these get passed down. And I mean,
and the desire for equality is in itself someone's own prejudice, isn't it? It's
absolutely
what they want to see, so they put it in the textbook, and it might not be representative.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was thinking about my own education, and even a historical figure like Churchill, for example. I think we, especially in this country, will taught he's such a hero and galvanising force in the Second World War, and we will fight them on the beaches, blah, 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 blah. That
was the whole speech, I believe.
Right, well, pretty much. He wasn't a particularly good guy, and there are so many shades of grey to him. I mean, this is a really obvious example. I'm not sort of reinventing the wheel with this, but, his treatment of... I used to date a guy who was half Italian, and he found it so offensive that people thought Churchill was his hero because Churchill's treatment of interned Italians in this country, and the Arion Star, which was, the ship that went down, his phrase, collar the lot, about Italians. There were lots of really murky areas to do with our historical events and figures that we totally brush over. And the other thing I thought which was really tricky was factual inaccuracies in culture and the way history blends into culture, and we get it horribly wrong. So The Darkest Hour, which was Joe Wright's film from last year about Churchill, there were so many factual inaccuracies about that, and I know a few people who saw that film and genuinely walked away from it thinking that's what happened, and actually it wasn't. At one point Churchill takes this mythical ride on the London Underground and does like a vox pop of what people think on the tube, like, should we fight the Nazis? And they're like, yes, Churchill, let's fight the Nazis. I mean, that just never happened. But there's that danger that people walk away from the cinema by being like, oh my God, Churchill got on the London Underground.
I thought that happened.
But you might like.
I really did. I saw that film and I assumed that was such. I thought
you think Churchill jumped out of his taxi and took a tube?
Yeah. I didn't think it happened like that, with everyone sort of cheering by the end of the scene. I knew that was Hollywood, but I assumed that was such an audacious plot device that it must be based on historical fact.
But was there any evidence to suggest that the people of Britain actually wanted us to go into a war with the Nazis? I have a feeling that if he had...
Don't bring me into the decision to go to war with the Nazis. I'm just saying that I thought that event happened, and I didn't go looking for evidence. So you're right. I'm saying that's an interesting example.
But I think that's the thing, isn't it? You could say, these are like ludicrous things to take away, but how many people in politics have invoked the spirit of Churchill recently in the past 2 years in this country, and actually it's a falsehood. And I think that's the worry, and the way that we should look at the way we teach history and all of those things is actually, instead of kind of like saying, okay, this is a definitive guide to what's happened, actually saying maybe we don't know exactly what happened, maybe actually we will find out later on, and it's about a kind of learning.
But again, that's a nuanced conversation, isn't it, of the type that we can have here now, but is difficult in an A-level classroom. The point is, most people would agree that the decision to go to war against the Nazis was a good one, but...
I thought you didn't want to be dragged into the decision to go to war.
No, I'm talking about now. 21st century children now might agree that was the right decision. But the question of whether or not Churchill was a good guy, as you put it, is a different question.
But that's no reason to try to improve the not to try to improve the curriculum. I think that if you find glaring factual inaccuracies, then you're going to want to correct those. And if it turns out that your textbooks are making massive cultural assumptions that are really quite unfair, then those also deserve to be revisited. So I think that, the point about changing the education system to respond to areas where you can improve it is definitely a legitimate one.
Well, you can continue the debate, it says here, by sharing your favourite historical moments with us. We are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter, and you can write us a review on Apple Podcasts to help like-minded listeners discover us. But that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Felicity, Capon and Arion McNicoll. Remember to hit subscribe to get this show every week. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app. of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Thanks to our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.